Coming to you from Brick House in downtown Brooklyn, this is 112BK. On the show today, the evils of social media, and I'm not just talking about bots, and youth dating violence here in NYC. Hi and welcome to the show. I'm Ashley Ford, and last week a Republican state senator from Bay Ridge proposed putting what he called smart scanners into New York schools to detect guns and prevent other dangerous items from being brought in. Metal detectors have been pretty controversial in the city schools. Most often found in the more segregated and lower income schools, they criminalize students and make them feel, well, not like they're going into a nurturing environment so much as a surveillance state. And of course, metal detectors are usually placed in the schools with the fewest resources for providing adequate access to books, pencils, and even classrooms. The senator, Marty Golden, didn't say exactly what the new technology would be, but from the sounds of it, it would be like the new scanner TSA uses at airports, where you wait in long lines, empty your pockets, hold up your hands, and then receive a pat down anyway. TSA doesn't require this scan for kids under 12 because of the false positives that require successive pat downs. And I'm also sure there aren't many parents who want to watch while some stranger adult rubs their hands all over their kid. Plus, does it really work to keep kids safe? Not really. For one thing, these systems would have to be employed around the clock, which means anytime kids or teachers or other adults wanted to enter the building, ever, even after hours, after outdoor gym class, during PTA meetings, they'd have to go through the detector. Good luck keeping kids literally in line for at least 13 years, just so you don't have to pass common sense gun control laws. Here's hoping Generation Z is actually as rebellious as they already seem to be. On the show today, I'll face off with someone who says we should dismantle social media. No, really, I might actually agree with him, to a point. Also, we're going to talk about youth dating violence in the city. It's more widespread than you might think. But first, school officials in New York City have been struggling, it seems like for decades, to figure out how to fix the issue of segregation in schools, some of the worst in the country. And it appears like the latest efforts haven't worked, especially when it comes to the specialty schools. These schools require 8th graders to take rigorous exams or auditions. The tests were revamped last year so as not to give advantage to those who could afford expensive test prep. But last week, we learned that only 10% of the students offered seats in 8 specialty schools are Black or Latino. And at the elite Stuyvesant School, only 10 of the 902 kids offered a spot are Black. Mayor de Blasio says this process has to change, but he can't change it without assent from the state legislature. Good to know that most of the control of the city schools lies in the hands of people who have no connection to the city. There was an added feature in front of the Metropolitan Museum's Temple of Dendur this weekend. Hundreds of prescription pill bottles floating in the temple's moat. The installation was the inspiration of New York artist Nan Golden, but it wasn't sanctioned by the museum. The 2,000-year-old Egyptian temple is housed in the Sackler wing, the Brooklyn-born Sackler brothers being the ones behind notorious Purdue Pharma, makers and marketers of OxyContin. The pill bottles were a protest by Golden and 100 others who chanted, "Sacklers lie, people die." She said she wanted the family to fund rehabs and not museums. After about 20 minutes, the protesters left peacefully. The LIU basketball Blackbirds, our neighbors just around the corner, are back in the NCAA championships. It's the team's first time back in the big dance in 5 years. But the party might be short-lived. They compete in the first game of the tourney on Tuesday night against Radford. Who? In what's called a play-in game, the winner of which gets the privilege of then taking on the region's #1 seed. LIU would be seeded number 16, and a 16 seed has never beaten a #1. To put a punctuation on it, when ESPN assessed the chances of the participants in this year's tourney, LIU topped the list of teams with no real chance, which is different than no chance, but not really. Back in a moment with our first conversation. The social media giants have had a couple of rough years. Facebook has been blamed for getting Trump elected. Twitter has become a hive of Russian bots. And these days, they're the two American companies that people love to hate on Facebook or Twitter. Or in retro ways, like in a book, such as Terms of Service, Social Media and the Price of Constant Connection. Today, we have the author of that book, Jacob Silverman, here to talk about the evils of social media. Well, let me close out my Instagram. All right, and Jacob, welcome to 112BK.
Thanks for having me.
Jacob, this is fascinating to me, okay, because people who listen to or watch the show probably have some idea that, like, I'm heavily involved in social media. It's something that I've been grappling with a lot over the past year, especially on social media,
right.
Because I'm trying to have a conversation about social media on social media, which I'm not gonna lie to you, isn't going great, Jacob. But you write about this world in which many of us are unthinkingly or unknowingly kind of becoming lemmings when it comes to social media. And we're not really paying attention to things like privacy or connection, things like that. It's just content, like, reward, you know, the mouse in the cheese trap. Like, what do you call that thing? Like the reward thing. It's a maze, right? But if we feel like we don't have anything to lose, which is, I feel like, what happens with a lot of people who are kind of willy-nilly with their privacy online, what's wrong with that?
Well, I feel like, first of all, we've been trained to devalue our privacy. So when I critique some of these big companies and how they affect issues of privacy, I think it's first important to acknowledge that we've been trained not to value our privacy very much, that it's not a big deal to give away all of your personal information to these companies. I mean, one thing we've certainly seen the rise of in the last few years is that there's forms of discrimination that we're all familiar with in the physical world, redlining or discrimination in retail shopping, things like that, which now appears online. For example, Facebook has gotten in trouble several times for showing that you can target ads to basically minority groups, and also you can target ads to people like Jew haters. That was a category for Facebook advertising for a while, because Facebook is all about micro-targeting certain groups. So that means, say you want to do a real estate advertisement for a new housing development, but you only want a certain type of people to show up for the open houses. You could target to a certain ethnic group, and until recently that was allowed on Facebook. Now they've sort of scaled back some of what they allow with these, I think they call them affinity-based advertisements.
Right.
So I think, basically, to sum it up, we enter this world assuming that it's going to be a lot more democratic, a lot more fair somehow than the world we're used to. But we're not the ones really in control of our personal information or of how it's being used to market to us especially.
So when you went on tour for this book, or when you've talked to people about this book, how much do people seem concerned about their privacy? Like the people who are talking to you about it, do they seem very concerned? Or are they coming to you and being like, you're a little intense and no one needs to worry about this that much?
Well, I see both. I think a few years ago when my book first came out, there was a little more resistance for people to see this as a problem. Someone once very memorably said to me that you're telling people that candy is bad for them. And I think at that point people weren't quite as ready for this kind of critique. There were definitely people who I encountered who said, yeah, I'm worried about these big companies, I don't like lots of information being collected about me, but people sort of struggle to put that into terms. So that's what I really try to do in my writing, is give people kind of a critical framework and a language to talk about these kinds of issues. And I think over the past couple of years, as you described in the introduction, attitudes have kind of shifted, and people are starting to take a more critical eye towards these companies, but they're still sort of figuring out, how do we describe this? You know, what kind of power do these companies wield? What kind of power do they wield over us, over our elections, things like that? So
what's your central critique of social media as it stands right now?
Well, I think that basically a surveillance-based economy, which is what social media is, it's all about collecting as much data as possible about its users, is inherently an undemocratic and really just unfair space from the perspective of user rights. There are a lot of sayings about how if you're not paying for something, you are the product. We're both the product and sort of the laborers, because we post the content that makes these big platforms rich. And because there are only a few platforms, that contributes to a huge concentration of power, of control over information, especially with Facebook and Google, of course. But Twitter still exerts a major role on the direction of the news cycle. So I think that concentration of power combined with this sort of personal data and surveillance-driven economy is really unhealthy.
Yeah, I mean, when you say it like that, it sounds unhealthy. But I have to, but I have to ask, you know, like, in all of that, one of the things that I'm thinking as you say those is, what is the alternative for people who want a way to connect socially, but don't want to have to essentially sign over, you know, all of this data to a company or all of their content to a company? It's like, is there a place where you can still like create a network online for you and your family and your friends and people whose thoughts you like or whatever, and you're not being taken advantage of in this way? Does that exist?
It's hard to say. I mean, there are these sort of small platforms like Ello was one that was popular a couple of years ago, and every so often one sort of bubbles into above the surface and you hear about it. And so there are definitely platforms out there, social platforms, that are built on more principles of, say, no advertising, no data collection, or more decentralization. But they don't really have what are called network effects, which is basically as a network gains more members, it becomes more useful and more profitable. So that's, again, why I don't blame users, or I use a lot of these products. I'm not on Facebook, but I'm on Twitter, and I use a fair amount as a journalist. But we're all sort of entangled in these platforms and these modes of communication, and the utility of them, I think, is pretty obvious. That's why they became so popular. But there are other models out there, cooperatives. There's a movement to buy Twitter and turn it into a cooperative. It's not necessarily likely, but the technology for some of these services is pretty simple in some ways and could be repurposed to really decentralize power in a fundamental way. Or you could wait for the Justice Department to intervene and eventually break up Facebook, which I don't know exactly what that will look like, but it's certainly possible. There's a lot more antitrust talk just in the last few months or year than there had been in the last decade, I'd say.
Where do we find opportunities to detangle ourselves? Are there just small things? What do you do?
Well, I think there are a couple questions or ways to tackle this. There's sort of the day-to-day, what's sometimes called digital hygiene, which this means things like turn off notifications or perhaps remove apps from your phone, set certain hours for yourself to engage with this stuff. And I think all of that's very valid. At the same time, I think people need to have this larger systemic critique of who are these companies, what are they doing, how do they treat their users, where does our data go, what are politicians doing about this, what kind of companies or government entities are Facebook and Google and Twitter making deals with. And that's the big picture stuff, but I think that's equally important, and I think people need to come around to that as we see this great influence that they're exerting.
I want to talk to you about those, you know, targeted meme ads and things on Facebook. Like, is that weaponizing social media, or is that just using it?
That's a really good distinction to make. I think in a lot of ways it's just using social media as it's intended. You're just targeting people based on their demonstrated interests and their data profiles that they've developed on Facebook and other places. And the difference that perhaps elevates it to that weaponized category is that there's a specific political message or an intention to sow chaos from a foreign power. But if the Trump campaign in some ways was doing very similar things, they were just doing it perhaps more legitimately, which was they were targeting people with inflammatory ads and material and trying to rile up voters who might turn against Clinton in one way or another, or people who might be encouraged to not vote at all. So in that sense, I think what makes it so unsettling or painful for Facebook to look at is that in a lot of ways their product was used as intended. The big problem, though, also is that users rarely have any idea where their advertising is coming from or what viewpoint it's trying to put forward. So we expect a certain amount of suspicion and skepticism out of users out there, out of readers, that we've come a long way from the internet chain letter. But it seems that that's not the case, that people are still very credulous, or when they see information being passed to them by their friends and family, they assume that it's somehow legitimate. And I think what the bot issue sort of represents is not only the capacity for misinformation to be weaponized, but also to travel through these social channels of familiar people and to therefore be more influential on us.
I read an article the other day, and forgive me, I can't say where, about the fact that for some reason even though most likely, I want to say news stories that are like really well done and based in fact, like they go faster initially, but that the ones that are heavily biased or that hold false information are the ones that last the longest,
okay.
I believe. Like just as far as being passed around and being shared among people. So then that makes me wonder, like, is there a way for social, especially when it comes to things like fake news, because everybody's talking about fake news right now, fake news, fake news, fake news. Is there a way to hold accountable the people who introduced fake news into the sphere, or is there not?
Well, there is. It's just the methods that are used are questionable, I'd say. You have companies like Facebook and YouTube who are saying we're hiring thousands of moderators.
Right.
Now, over the last few years, there's been a lot of great reporting on who these moderators actually are and the conditions they work under. They're often in developing world countries, but they're also here in the US and in Europe working in these big sort of cubicle farms where they're exposed all day to the horrible stuff that people post online, just the worst things you can imagine. Now, while that system may be effective in some ways, it's obviously very problematic.
Right.
So going after the people who are specifically posting fake news, I don't know if that can really be done in a systematized way, but it's also the responsibility to some extent of these companies to be able to moderate and police their platforms. So when they say simply we're hiring more moderators, it seems like you're taking an only partially effective solution and pouring more resources into it.
Right.
So I do think it is some responsibility of Facebook and Twitter and these companies to figure out ways that go beyond just simply throwing more money at the problem and hiring more moderators.
Do you have any ideas?
I don't know if I do, but they don't pay me to do that.
Right? Like, I might have some ideas if somebody comes up out the pocket and pays me for my ideas.
And part of the problem is also people like me don't have access to all the data that these companies have, and they know how things share, and they see that false information shares very widely. Even something like The Onion is one of the most shared sites on Facebook, so they know how that kind of information travels. And they see that the list of top shared sites are often very polarized, extreme, even just blatantly untrue sites. So that's something that Facebook could easily tackle by turning to those anthropologists and in-house sociologists and people that they hire to study that data, I think.
Right. Well, I hope they do. Jacob, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Last month was Teen Dating Violence Awareness Month. Its aim was to educate parents, teens, and community members on the disturbing prevalence of abusive relationships in this demographic. According to the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence, every year, 1.5 million high school students nationwide experience physical abuse in a dating context. On the parental side of things, data shows only 1 in 4 parents talk to their children about this kind of violence. Here to help us understand these statistics and what's being done to address this issue in New York City is Stephanie Rodriguez, Youth Coordinator at the Healing Center. Stephanie, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Can you just start by telling me really quickly, what is the Healing Center?
So the Healing Center is a domestic violence and sexual assault prevention and intervention agency that serves South Brooklyn, but all of New York City in general.
How did you get involved in this work, Stephanie?
I actually come from a performing arts background, and I started out volunteering with the Daughters of the Lotus program, doing dance therapy, things like that. And once the position opened, I left corporate and never looked back.
Tell me about Daughters of the Lotus.
So Daughters of the Lotus is a program for teen girls, gender fluid youth who have either experienced teen dating violence or who have witnessed domestic violence or just want to give back to the community.
That makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. I like that idea. What's your role as the youth coordinator?
So as the youth coordinator, I facilitate workshops in high schools talking about teen dating violence, healthy versus unhealthy relationships, what's the difference between consent and coercion. I also run the Daughters of the Lotus program where we do many of those workshops, but we also look at the intersectionalities between race, classism, xenophobia, sexism, toxic masculinity, and that. And we also are the founders of the New York City Teen Dating Violence Awareness Walkathon. It's on its 7th year. It brings teens from all over New York City to come together. We have a rally, and then we walk over the Brooklyn Bridge and end with a press conference at City Hall.
When's that?
April 14th.
April 14th. I'm going to ask you that again at the
Yes.
end, so you better not forget. What are you seeing in Brooklyn in regard to teen dating violence?
Well, what I'm seeing, and there's a very big trend of not discussing what teen dating violence is. Many people think domestic violence and they automatically think husband-wife, children involved, but the highest rates of domestic violence is going on in the teenage years from 16 to 24. Wow. So that's the high school years, that's the beginning of college. So I'm seeing there's not really much talk going on around teen dating violence, and especially within the households either.
Why do you think that is?
Because many people don't know themselves what a healthy relationship looks like. And we know that abuse is a cycle. So if your parents are in an unhealthy or abusive relationship, most likely you have a higher chance of being in one yourself also. So how can you have a conversation about something that you're going through yourself? So that I think that's, and it's an awkward conversation for parents to have.
Is that what's most alarming you with what you're seeing in Brooklyn right now, or is there something else?
I think what's also alarming me is everyone's thinking of physical abuse, you know, sexual assault, which is physical abuse. The Me Too movement is great. It's giving a voice to victims, but at the same time, there's so many other tactics that abusers use before they even get physical.
Right.
And one big thing that I see a lot of is isolation. And for a teenager, when this is your first relationship, it's like, oh wow, my partner wants to spend all this time with me, but little by little, they're actually isolating you to groom you. So that's, it's those tactics that people don't pay attention to that alarm me the most.
What happens to the teens who end up in a situation where they're experiencing partner violence? What happens, and I always wonder about this, like, if we get them in the teenage years, do we typically see that from then on they do pretty well in terms of relationships? Or is it like what we see, I think, more in adulthood where it becomes a bit of a pattern?
Right.
Because it's familiar.
Exactly. I think we need to get into the teenage years and even younger than that. Having K through 12 programming in schools on what a healthy relationship is, what good touches are, what bad touches are, because we need, once you start learning this from a young age, it becomes embedded in you.
Right.
So you're less likely to end up in an abusive relationship because you know the signs to look out for. And it's not so taboo, it's not so secret, so you feel more comfortable being able to speak about it because you were having these educational workshops from a young age.
Right.
So prevention is so important. Prevention and education are so important to be able to eradicate any type of abuse.
I also think about the gendered aspect of abuse, and specifically an intimate partner or domestic violence or teen dating violence. The gendered issue is always really interesting to me because I think there are times when people say, well, you know, if it's a gender non-conforming person, or if it's a guy and a guy, or a woman and a woman, it's like, well, then it's not domestic violence.
Right.
Because of the gender. Like, it's only domestic violence when men hit women, who they are in romantic relationships with.
Which is completely not true. We know that it's happening in the LGBTQ community. Where we're having some of the issues, figure out who the primary aggressor is. So if you're not trained, so for a police officer to come in and there was a call, a domestic dispute happened, they come in, they see two females or they'll see two males, they'll usually go after whichever looks most masculine because it's embedded in us, masculine hitting the feminine. Right. So that's where we're seeing a bit of an issue come in. And then especially when you add on LGBTQ, race, socioeconomics, then it just becomes a whole big mess.
Can you talk to me about specifically race and social economics?
So there's a big stereotype that domestic violence mostly happens in minority communities and immigrant communities, but it's not true. It happens to everyone regardless of your sex, gender identity, race, religion. It affects everyone, socioeconomic class. But where it becomes more difficult is when you have to get services. So at the Healing Center, all our services are free. Many nonprofits in New York City, it's the same way. But we can only go so far. You need the therapy. You need trauma-informed therapy. A therapist can be very expensive. If the therapist doesn't have a background in DV, doesn't understand the trauma that happens when it comes to domestic violence, they can't really deal with the trauma correctly. So to go to have Medicaid and go to a social worker at a hospital, they're not really equipped to deal with the issue at hand.
That's what I'm thinking, that there are a lot of people who definitely have the spirit wanting to help, but don't necessarily have the tools. So parents, teachers, community members, how can they help?
Educating yourself on the myths, breaking down stereotypes, checking your own language. For so long we use syntax like Maria was beaten instead of Paul hit Maria, so which puts accountability on the perpetrator versus the victim. Victim blaming, not victim blaming. And also people, when they want to help, they get scared and they just want the person to leave. When you force someone to leave, you're doing the same thing that the abuser does, because domestic violence, teen dating violence, at its core is about power and control over another person. So if you're forcing someone to leave a relationship without their free will, you're putting your power over them also. So you're doing the same thing as the perpetrator. So we believe that we are an anchor, so we're here from when you want services. We're here. You don't leave our center without a safety plan for if you're going to stay in the relationship or leave the relationship, because safety is our #1 concern. Because it's a powerful thing to be able to take your power back and say, I'm done with this relationship, versus it being forced onto you.
Yes, yes. Tell me again, one more time, how people can participate in this walk-a-thon.
So the walk happens every year. It's our 7th year. We're very proud of it. We have some great co-sponsors that help us out with the walk. It's April 14th. You can register online. You can find our information through our website, which is www.healingcenterny.org, which will take you to our registration page. All students who participate get community service hours. And it's a really fun rally where we have performers. We come together as a community and we have our voices heard. And it's great to have teens have their voices heard, because they're the ones who need to lead this fight. You know, they're the ones who are going to be the future activists. They're the ones who are going to be the future leaders, the future therapists. So it's great for them to take control over this walk.
Definitely, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And thanks for joining us today. On 112BK tomorrow, we'll get updated on the latest DACA developments, a college prep program for low-income minority women, and how to slay. Hope you can join us.